In 1975, the people of Britain had voted decisively in favour of staying in the common market. It was a decision, said the pro-marketeers, to leave behind a grey, tired insularity and make a choice for sunlight and a brave new world. It was a time when promises came easily. There'd be more jobs, more markets for our goods, industry as modern as the Germans, food as good as the French. In truth, in the remaining years of the Labour government, the European idea ran out of steam. James Callaghan had always been ambivalent about it, and his party was beset by bitter internal battles. Then, in 1979, in came Margaret Thatcher. She headed the Party of Europe, the party that had taken us into the common market, the party that felt at home there. It was meant to be the moment when the whole thing would begin to work. Not so. Within 7 years of our new start in Europe, the issue had, as usual, claimed its victims. The Labour Party had split, and Europe had been one of the key matters on which passions ran high. Mrs. Thatcher bulldozed from summit to summit, fighting Britain's corner, but she made a series of mistakes which came to haunt her and ended up opposing much of what the community stood for, while other Europeans, for their part, became fed up to the back teeth with her.
Europe is a community of nations dedicated towards one goal.
Oh.
Now, may we share the joke, Humphrey?
Oh, Minister. Now, let's look at this objectively. It is a game played for national interests and always was. Why do you suppose we went into it?
To strengthen the brotherhood of free Western nations.
Oh, really? We went in to screw the French by splitting them off from the Germans.
Well, why did the French go into it, then?
Those games were played behind the grey facades of Brussels. But Mrs. Thatcher had a potential ally. The former Labour cabinet minister, Roy Jenkins, was now president of the European Commission.
The Conservative Party in the 70s is quite difficult to believe now, but it had been a great party of Europe. In that 1979 election, I was very torn. I did think that the Conservative government probably would be better for Britain's attitude to Europe.
This was a time, remember, when Mrs. Thatcher had won the election in '79 as being the person who would be more friendly to Europe than the horrible Labour ministers. And this was the sort of Europhoria of the Tories and even Mrs. Thatcher in '79. History is rewritten, of course, that she was always opposed to the European community, always antagonistic. She became antagonistic to the Foreign Office position on Europe and to Europe, but how she was treated in Dublin in the autumn of 1979.
Dublin was Mrs. Thatcher's first big summit. While the security men were checking for bombs, the Prime Minister prepared to ask for what became known as Mrs. Thatcher's billion, the gap between what Britain paid into the community and what it got out. Her aim, reduce that gap virtually to zero before any other business was done.
Broadly speaking, for every £2 we contribute, we get £1 back. That leaves us with a net contribution of £1,000 million next year to the community and rising in the future. It's that £1,000 million on which we started to negotiate because we want the greater part back.
In effect, this cash was the fee that Britain was paying for late entry into the European club. Thatcher was offended that most countries, like France, had their snouts deep in the euro trough, which was replenished by just two countries, Britain and Germany. That was her message, but it was her style that really upset the others.
She several times during this meeting, Dublin 2, said she wanted her money back, and she wanted it now.
She never knew when to attack and when to pause, so that she often went on counterproductively when the effectiveness of her attack turned into boring people who might be her allies.
I made the remark to my friend Giscard, she hasn't paid a single penny as yet, and already she wants her pennies back.
Schmidt and Giscard were fed up. One of them pretended to get asleep, the other got very bored, and I think she prejudiced our case.
They're all so smooth. I like some bony bits in personality, some prickly bits, some things you can argue with, because it's only that way that you get to a solution. Diplomacy won't necessarily bring you to a solution.
The response of the European smoothies was calculated to offend. The summit went from bad to worse.
I think they were quite rude to her. I remember she really was hopping mad, and Lord Carrington thought they'd behaved very badly. You know, they paid no attention to her interventions and more or less told her to shut up, which was very imprudent of them, really.
Well, it's anybody's guess who has been more discourteous at that meeting than the other.
The way in which she conducted herself turned them off, and when that had happened, you knew it was no good going on with the meeting. You would have to draw stumps and start again later on.
I have great respect and liking for Margaret Thatcher, but when she took such positions, no one took her seriously, neither on the British side nor on the side of the others.
The leaders gathered for a glum photo call. Thatcher had been offered a third of a loaf and she had chucked it back. Dublin had set the tone. From then on, Thatcher and her fellow leaders would rarely enjoy each other's company.
She didn't trust continental Europeans. That was it. And I mean, we were people which were different, and so they couldn't be trusted outside of her sight.
That suspicion of Europeans marinated nicely through a series of unproductive meetings over the next few months. Diplomats on all sides were anxious to reach a settlement, and another summit was arranged in Luxembourg. There was an improved offer on the table.
It was a good offer, and I think most of the British people there at Luxembourg were in favour of accepting it, but Mrs. Thatcher didn't like it, so it was refused, whereupon both the Germans and the French withdrew their offer.
They were rocked backwards when I turned it down. We'll never offer you anything more. But I said, but it's our money.
Our money? You just didn't talk like that. Schmidt and Giscard went home in disgust, refusing to have anything more to do with the matter. And it fell to the Foreign Office, not exactly full of Mrs. Thatcher's bony men, to pick up the pieces in Brussels.
Peter Carrington turned up, I think having had a pretty disagreeable, difficult meeting with Mrs. Thatcher, so he wasn't in the best of tempers. But eventually it was agreed that we should negotiate and sit up all night if necessary, which turned out to be necessary.
Agreement was reached, as far as I remember, just about 6:30 or 7 the following morning, and it was then that the Foreign Secretary, the Lord Privy Seal, flew off to London to let the Prime Minister know what had been achieved.
We thought we'd got a very tolerable, not to say favourable, agreement. Indeed, it was undoubtedly better than Luxembourg, and as good as any we were likely to get, so we were extremely pleased.
Carrington and Gilmore had got a 3-year deal, and on the way home, they celebrated in the way that Foreign Office chaps do.
Peter Carrington and Ian Gilmore and I all thought we'd done rather well, and I think I remember rightly I gave them a bottle of champagne to drink after breakfast in the airplane going back, where they had to go and report to Mrs. Thatcher Chequers.
Oh dear. Their boss, who had probably had iron filings rather than champagne for breakfast, was not amused.
We were welcomed with enormous hostility. Sharp words were exchanged, and the discussion continued without getting noticeably more friendly for quite a long time.
They came in with some civil servants, so it was not very easy. And I must say that at the beginning I just said, look, you haven't got everything, you've sold us out on 1 year.
You basically thought that we hadn't stood up for British interests, and that we'd behaved like the wet Foreign Office, unlike her, and so forth. And then she said she would resign, then we said we would resign, and so on like that. It was all a bit childish, but it went on for some time. And by the time we came to lunch, we were still really no nearer agreeing.
They were tired, they'd been up all night, but Thatcher still seemed prepared to block the deal. The Foreign Office team left Chequers. Gilmore picked up the phone.
For once I had rather a good public relations idea, first and last time in my life probably, which was that we should bill it as a Thatcherite triumph, give no hint that there was any disagreement between the Prime Minister and the Foreign Office Minister. And of course this went down very well. Virtually every paper said this was a thoroughly good agreement. So by Monday, really, the battle was more or less over.
By the time we came to the Cabinet on the Monday morning, the weekend press, manipulated by Ian Gilmore to some extent, had gone a long way towards convincing her. So at the Cabinet, I supported their view that it was right. She put up a rearguard action, which she allowed to be overwhelmed pretty quickly.
But in the whole tale of Mrs. Thatcher's money, of comings and goings from summit to summit, something important was lost.
In the course of that argument, her good relations, her intention to bring a new constructive spirit to Europe, if you like, the cause of conservative Europeanism, really perished in that argument.
At the Suffolk fishing port of Lowestoft, trawlermen formed a blockade across the harbour mouth.
It wasn't just at the conference table that the dream was turning sour. The very same day, half a ton of wet cod was dumped on a government doorstep in London. Common fish policies, common farm policies, common this, common that. The benefits of membership of the community were escaping most Britons.
It all boils down to the common market. Either help us or get us out, that's all we're asking.
The voters were fed up with the common market's waste. Mountains of surplus grain, lakes of undrunk wine, warehouses groaning with meat and butter. The huge economic benefits that would flow from membership seemed an illusion. The country was in its deepest post-war recession. Hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs were lost. Demonstrations and riots were commonplace.
This will be card vote number 5.
Though Europe had little to do with Britain's economic woes, it became a convenient scapegoat. The Labour Party started racing to the left, and in October 1980 reverted to its anti-European stance. Now Labour wanted withdrawal from the community without a referendum.
At last, the wraps have dropped from people's eyes, and the full reality of the sellout, of what occurred when Mr. Heath took us in against our will, without any parliamentary or constitutional process. That's what happened. A rape of the British people and of the British Parliament and the rights of our Constitution.
The Labour Party had a fit of collective insanity, and it was thrashing about to be different from the Tories and to follow what it thought was a exclusively and distinctively socialist line. There's no way you can write down on a piece of paper an explanation for our attitude towards the community over those 6 years that stands any logical analysis.
The next Labour government must disengage Britain from the EEC. The British people, I believe, are now saying enough is enough.
I thought it was appalling that 5 years after the referendum, which was carried not by a tiny margin but by a substantial majority in the whole of the country, with every region except one voting yes, that we should find ourselves in the Labour Party faced with a resolution to get out, which nobody suggested should be put to another referendum.
When the Labour Party went, as I would see it, crazy against Europe, against nuclear weapons, against sensible economic policies, it was clear to me I couldn't stay in that parliament, the 79-83 parliament. And the option was go or break from the Labour Party and help create the SDP.
So David Owen, Shirley Williams, Bill Rogers and Roy Jenkins started the Social Democratic Party.
Right away, please, lads.
They all had a history. Back in 1971, all four had defied the Labour Party whips and voted in favour of entry. The split in the Labour Party, long threatened, had finally happened.
The most important issue, I would say, was the absurdity of suggesting that we could leave Europe. And because we couldn't join the Conservatives, they stood for all sorts of things we had absolutely no support to give them. We had to form a new party, and so we ended up with the SDP.
Led by Jenkins, now back from Brussels, the SDP and its Liberal allies campaigned in the 1983 election as the most pro-market party of all. And they came within a whisker of getting more votes than Labour. Labour was now led by Michael Foot and committed to a set of left-wing policy documents. The few remaining pro-European MPs were isolated. But as the manifesto was drawn up, they still hoped that they could stave off the worst.
The 83 manifesto is, as you'll recall, the longest suicide note in history. Though, in fact, it wasn't all that long. It was 36 pages. It just seemed long. Now, what we should have done was when the National Executive and the Shadow Cabinet met to decide on the manifesto, we should have had the row there and then. Dennis was going to have a row on defence policy, and I was going to have a row on Europe. But the most extraordinary thing happened. A man called John Golding, the hammer of the left, the pillar of the right, said, I'm going to move that all the policy documents are incorporated into the manifesto. And we said, but crazy. We're going to get this a better manifesto. That would make it a crazy manifesto. And he said, I know it would make it a crazy manifesto, but it would make it Ben's manifesto. We're going to lose this election, whatever happens, and we're going to lose it on Ben's terms.
The campaign is about issues, about how to get out of the common market and how to stop American nuclear bases.
Tony Benn was delighted with the outcome.
There's very wide support, you know, in the country for the policies.
People who I regard as reactionaries voted, indeed proposed, that manifesto because they thought they were going to teach Tony Benn a lesson. Now, I regard that as crazy beyond belief, but it's what happened.
We're on the way to victory.
No, they weren't. Michael Foot just became more and more a pathetic figure heading for ignominious defeat.
Right, here we are. Now, where's the driver? So.
Mrs. Thatcher, on the other hand, was in her prime. The Falklands factor was at its height, the economy was past its worst. And if Labour was going to be anti-Europe, she, at least in public, would be all for it.
Now, Labour's leaders, once again their manifesto confirms that in the end, Labour always runs away. They're at it again in this election as fast as their legs can carry them. They're running out on Europe.
Thatcher won a landslide victory. The public had endorsed the Party of Europe and rejected withdrawal as an idea of Labour's loony left. But it wasn't only the Labour Party she'd seen off. The long-serving leaders of France and Germany were gone. Giscard had been replaced by François Mitterrand and Schmidt by Helmut Kohl. Thatcher was now Europe's senior politician, yet even at the peak of her powers, she could make little headway round the summit table. The obstacle to good relations was her obsession with getting her money back. The Carrington deal on the budget had expired, and Thatcher wanted a long-term solution. But at summit after summit, the other member states said no. Matters came to a head at Fontainebleau. In the 16th century chateau outside Paris, Thatcher hoped to persuade Germany, the other major contributor to the budget, to break ranks with France and side with Britain. And she hoped that Mitterrand, on his own turf, would want the credit of settling the bloody British budget question once and for all. Around the table, she was to find, as all British Prime Ministers had, that there was little daylight between the French and the Germans. On the first day, the budget wasn't even mentioned. As the leaders went off to dine at a small country inn, Mrs. Thatcher thought they would finally get down to talking about her money. But no, they got down to their food instead.
We thought that it was possible that there would be a discussion at dinner. We briefed Mrs. Thatcher very fully for it, but in point of fact there was no discussion at the heads of government dinner on the subject at all.
Quite the opposite. Mrs. Thatcher, not known for her chat, had to listen to Chancellor Cole's small talk.
Mrs. Thatcher found this a most unbusinesslike way of proceeding. She never told an anecdote in her life, and the thought of listening to Chancellor Cole and President Mitterrand anecdoting on was purgatory.
The foreign ministers hadn't discussed it either. To Thatcher's fury, she found they had spent their time at the Hotel Babreau outdoing each other with travellers' tales. So as everybody started packing their bags on the final morning, the people with their work cut out were the heads of government's personal advisers. Helmut Kohl's was Horst Teltschik, Francois Mitterrand's was Jacques Attali, and for Mrs. Thatcher there was Charles Pole.
President Mitterrand's sense of tactical timing and handling was rather good. He kept it until the deadline, the end of the meeting, was in sight, so people knew they were up against a time when it had to be settled, and really it was all done. The final stages were all done that last morning.
Mrs. Thatcher was ready for a fight. She wanted to go home with her money. Kohl and Mitterrand had a 60% rebate in mind. She wanted 70%. Attali, no fool he, could see Thatcher's tactics a mile off.
Mrs. Thatcher was doing her best to divide the French and the Germans. During this morning, there was contact between her aides and Chancellor Kohl's aides to try to find a coalition between the Germans and the British against the French.
Charles Pole was trying to fix a private meeting between Thatcher and Chancellor Kohl, precisely what the Germans wanted to avoid.
She tried to meet him during the summit when the Chancellor was not ready to do that, because to give in, it must be at the right time, you see, and not when Margaret Thatcher was interested.
She was mad against Chancellor Kohl. She said, we pay a lot for our army in your country, you should agree on us, we thought that you were allied. Actually, she was mixing NATO with the community. And there was a break. She wanted to see Chancellor Kohl. He refused to see her.
The whole axis there was France and Germany. France and Germany. And what those said, the others tended to agree with.
Thatcher did manage to see Mitterrand privately. He raised his offer to 65%, but that was now final.
Mitterrand said to her, it's a take or leave proposal. It's 65 full stop. And she almost broke in tears. The first time I saw that she realized that she was totally isolated, and she broke like glass, and she couldn't even discuss anything else, and then she accepted the deal.
For Margaret Thatcher, there was no alternative. She had to do that which she most despised, compromise with the smooth Europeans. Still, she did hold out for 66%.
Even in the final hours of negotiation, she changed the figure from 65 to 66%, because then she could describe her rebate as a 2/3 rebate, which sounded nicer. So she really fought for it to the very bitter end, and everybody else was exasperated and gave her what she wanted.
She settled for 2/3, and I think in the final round she said this, and President Mitterrand said, well, Mrs. Thatcher wants 2/3, she must have 2/3. And that is really what enabled it to break the ice and get the thing settled.
The deal wasn't quite as good as it looked. Mrs. Thatcher could say she'd got a rebate worth 2/3 of Britain's contribution, but in cash terms it was still less than she'd wanted.
Fontainebleau was more a question of face saving for all the leaders. Mrs. Thatcher wanted drastically 2/3, and she had 2/3, but it was not 2/3 of the same amount that she was claiming from the very beginning.
We've got 66% of a certain gap between what we put in and what we get out. It's not quite the whole amount, but it's 66%, and it will last much longer than any previous agreement. It is very complicated. I'm so sorry. It's full of jargon, but I assure you it's a reasonable agreement.
When I heard that she'd decided to settle, I remember saying to myself, how on earth am I going to sell this? How is she going to defend this on the floor of the Commons? Or whether I could sell it to the press. I remember writing the opening statement for her press conference in the corridor, doing my best to make the most of what had been achieved, consistent with credibility. As a matter of fact, she not merely got away with it, but I think was recognized as being something of a statesman in settling in the way in which she did.
Indeed, she passed it off as a great victory.
I was ashamed to see the British government as a beggar. And if the win is to receive a lot of money as a beggar, it was a victory.
On the short run, she won. She got far more than she should have got. On the short run, she won, but whether a political price had to be paid on the longer run is very difficult to say.
Well, she wasn't paying a price where it would have worried her back home. She had battled for Britain, it was thought, and won. True grit trumps continental waffle, long-term solution, Eurocrats humble, that sort of thing. And there was something to this, for the community was entering one of its comatose phases. In the Council of Ministers, each nation was using its veto to block measures it didn't like. In the Commission, draft laws were bogged down in endless meetings. The need to translate everything into a growing number of community languages had made Brussels the sort of place that Kafka would have loved. It seems extraordinary, then, that in the next few years, Mrs. Thatcher, with all her stature in the world, should have made a series of fundamental missteps which would haunt Britain for years. But she did. Misstep number one came over the appointment of a new president of the Commission to get the community moving again. Thatcher backed Jacques Delors, who had been Mitterrand's tough-minded finance minister. She didn't have to. She could have thrown her weight behind another Frenchman, former foreign minister Claude Chesson.
It had been agreed at the last minute that the turn of the Germans to take the presidency of the Commission would be left to the French. That was decided in Fontainebleau, in the European Council of Fontainebleau. It had then been agreed between the two of them, the Chancellor and the French President, that I would be the one. Margaret Thatcher saying, no, Chesson, no, no. I know him, no, it won't be Chesson. Chesson, never.
Chesson, this garrulous little bow-tied French socialist, full of do-gooding ideas and love of high spending, was not her cup of tea at all. So she was inclined to prefer Delors, and I too was inclined to. So I agreed, I thought Delors was the better bet.
So Delors it was. Thatcher thought he was the man who would realise her vision of Europe, one where trade would flow freely but sovereignty would stay at home. She and Lawson thought Delors was a man they could do business with. Boy, were they ever mistaken.
Probably I was wrong. I mean, probably it would have been, in many ways, more sensible to have had the ineffective Chesson, would have caused fewer problems for Britain. But at that time, at any rate, I was of the view that we ought to have as president somebody who was skillful and effective and could do a job of that size.
The romantic goal of the job was a Europe without frontiers, where customs and red tape were a thing of the past. Here, it seemed, was a European plan with which the free market, free trading, Thatcherite Tories could be in total agreement.
We wanted it. It fired the imagination of our parliamentarians, it fired the imagination of our cabinet and of Margaret Thatcher.
And indeed of Jacques Delors. But for him, a frontier-free Europe was about more than the passage of trade. That was just the means to an end, and the end was a United States of Europe. It was that which made Delors a man with a mission, which he now took round the capitals of Europe.
Je leur ai proposé 3 thèmes. Une défense commune, une monnaie unique, un changement des institutions pour aller vers une intégration politique. Et sur ces 3 sujets, il n'y avait pas unanimité des 10. Par conséquent, je leur ai proposé simplement de réaliser ce qui était prévu dans le traité de Rome, un marché unique fondé sur les 4 libertés de circulation des personnes, des biens, des services et des capitaux.
The man Thatcher sent to work with Delors was Arthur Cofield, a taxman turned retailer turned politician. From Thatcher's point of view, this didn't turn out to be any smarter than backing Delors. The cabinet thought they were sending to Brussels a somewhat cantankerous placeman to act as Thatcher's vicar on earth, someone who could do her bidding in exile.
Much as we all loved him, he could be extremely awkward and difficult as a cabinet colleague, and I think that there was considerable support for him going to Brussels for that reason.
Mrs. Thatcher had a rather nice expression about Arthur Cofield. She said he was the sort of man who couldn't pass a row of pigeonholes without wanting to fill every one of them, and that was exactly the sort of mind you needed.
But nature's paper pusher turned out to be a man with a mind of his own.
She was never aware and never accepted how wide the single market was, that it did cover an enormous span of policies and proposals which were absolutely essential if you were going to get a genuine single market in Europe.
A genuine single market. Once Cofield got down to work, he found himself drawn away from London's idea of what that meant and towards Brussels.
Il devenait de plus en plus pro-européen et il prenait fait et cause pour les positions de la Commission et même pour les positions de son président. Et il mena, à travers la presse et les médias, une grande campagne pour l'Europe.
Thatcher had not realized that to make the single market work, Delors' commission would soon meddle with stuff that she thought was way outside their brief, like taxation. She and Cofield finally fell out over his plan to harmonize VAT.
I said it was in the Treaty of Rome. She said it wasn't. I said it was. She said it wasn't. And her private secretary was therefore sent to get a copy of the Treaty of Rome. And I asked him to read out Article 99, which says quite specifically, the Commission shall, not may, shall present proposals for the harmonization of indirect taxation. I got no reply to this. And realizing, of course, that I wasn't going to get a reply, I pressed a little further. I said it was in the Treaty of Rome and you ought to have read it before you signed it. She said, I didn't sign it. I said, I know you didn't, but you were a member of the cabinet which did. And that also was greeted in total silence.
Already annoyed with the man who was supposed to be her friend in Brussels, Thatcher was about to have a row with those who wished her nothing but ill. The setting was Milan. It was the most acrimonious summit in Europe's history, a title for which there is stiff competition.
Milan European Council was hilarious in some respects. Heads of state and government comprehensively fell out. I mean, they are there to talk. If they won't talk to each other, you don't have much of a conference. And I do remember it was a pretty fraught atmosphere.
Italy's Euro-federalists laid on a display outside the conference. Thatcher had no time for their vision of a United States of Europe, On the other hand, she thought that if each government could use the veto to protect its national interests, the single market would be wrecked. The summit was held in the medieval Castello Sforzesco in the heart of Milan. The leaders sharpened their arguments, polished their armor, and got ready for combat. Thatcher arrived determined to get an informal understanding. Countries wouldn't veto measures designed to set up a single market. The last thing she wanted was a formal end to the veto. Those, on the other hand, who wanted not just a single market, but real political integration, were keen for the veto to be limited and saw an opportunity to get under Thatcher's guard. To revise the Treaty of Rome in that way required a special sort of summit called in Euro jargon an intergovernmental conference. That was what the Italians were after here in Milan.
The Italians wanted a success, were desperate for a success on their own territory, and were going to go to fairly extreme lengths to get it.
Thatcher turned up on day 2 still thinking she could get an informal deal. Her advisors had told her that she could veto an intergovernmental conference. But the Italian Prime Minister, Bettino Craxi, had looked at the rules more carefully.
The Italians pulled a procedural trick. They called a vote, and only a simple majority was needed. They got their way. There was an intergovernmental conference.
I think we had, rather remarkably, failed to foresee that an intergovernmental conference could be set up by a simple majority vote until we got there, so to speak.
Thatcher and Howe had egg on their faces. Craxi had outfoxed them. And slowly it dawned on the British that they would not get what they wanted, a single market, without giving the Continentals what they wanted, progress towards political integration. Thatcher had been outmaneuvered.
We came prepared to make decisions, prepared to make progress in very practical ways. Others didn't take that view. They wanted some grand, almost endless conference, and that, I'm afraid, that view has prevailed.
There was one last ambush in store for her. The castle's curator saw Thatcher's next misstep up close.
Alla fine del summit la signora Thatcher scende già furibonda per I fatti politici che non le erano graditi là sopra, scende, attraversa furibonda il cortile su questo selciato fatto come quello dei secoli scorsi quando le signore avevano scarpe senza tacchi, un tacco le si infila qui tra I sassi, inciampa, ruzzola, sta per cadere in avanti, 2 guardie del corpo per sua fortuna si sono precipitate ad afferrarla per le braccia, l'hanno sorretta all'ultimo momento e per un po' sono corsi in avanti abbracciati, sembravano dei giocatori di rugby durante una mischia.
High-heeled headmistress stumbles in Milan. It looked like a metaphor, and it was. The British were launched into 6 months of detailed negotiations to revise the Treaty of Rome, discussions going well beyond their original aim of a single market. The talks culminated in Luxembourg. On the table were the most significant changes to the community since its birth. Mrs. Thatcher was taking a gamble, the loss of the British veto in certain areas against the gains that would come from a true single market.
I suppose there are some people who are going to say, oh, this majority voting means that we could be voted down on important subjects.
Yes, but on the other hand, we do need to get some of our trade and business into the common market, which is stopped now because they won't agree to certain standards because one person can veto it. So we need to stop some of those abuses.
She accepted this very, very big increase in majority voting because she thought it necessary in order to get the right decisions taken to complete the single market. And I think she was right.
But now came another misstep. Although Thatcher had kept the veto in certain key areas, she allowed Delors to insert into the treaty a commitment to economic and monetary union. The Foreign Office had told her it didn't matter, but Delors knew better.
C'est moi qui ai insisté, et moi seul, pour qu'il y ait cette référence. Parce que je pensais à l'avenir. Et je voulais signifier par cette mention dans le traité que la communauté avait pour objet de réaliser l'intégration économique et monétaire.
I felt very uneasy at Margaret Thatcher and the British government, I must say, accepting this packaging. And I wrote a number of minutes warning her that we should not really sign up to anything which committed us to EMU, European Monetary Union. She was persuaded by the Foreign Office that this was really just a ritual form of words.
Nothing crucial was given away in Luxembourg or in the Single European Act. The references to economic and monetary union in the Single Act were not, in my view, of great significance.
Anybody who, in the Foreign Office or anybody else, who said that was it was of no significance, of no importance, either they didn't understand how the community works or that they were being economical with the truth.
At the last moment, Mrs. Thatcher hesitated about the whole deal.
Elle a suivi avec beaucoup d'attention les discussions sur ce traité. Elle dira peut-être plus tard qu'elle n'en avait pas perçu toute l'importance, mais elle a eu l'intuition que ce texte était important et elle a demandé quelques minutes de réflexion supplémentaires.
I think that she knew at the time that she was taking risks. You're always taking risks, especially when you've got the reservations that you want and you hope they will be honoured. But she was taking a calculated risk with a very clear view in mind, and that was the completion of a single internal market. That is what she was pursuing.
In the end, she swallowed hard and signed the treaty. Now she had to persuade Westminster to ratify the deal. This time, the trick was to undersell it.
The Common Market Summit ended late last night in Luxembourg after 2 long days of debate. But all that emerged were a few modest reforms of the Treaty of Rome.
Presentation in UK of the results of the Single Act were strongly influenced by the British government, whose position was we have to have the Single Act, we have to pay a price for that, which is some institutional and decision-making changes. Let's tell everybody that the price was a very small one, and hence that the return is a very big one.
Margaret Thatcher and I and the rest of us at the cabinet meeting after the Luxembourg Single European Act Summit were in no doubt that we had achieved all our negotiating objectives, that it was a success, and we sold it to Parliament as such.
The bill was taken to the Commons and forced through in a few days. On a wide range of issues, Westminster's sovereignty was taken away. Most MPs didn't even notice, and it scarcely made the news.
I can well remember how Mrs. Thatcher got that through the Commons. We started the debates on a Thursday, and MPs don't like complex debates on a Thursday because they want to go home. And the whip simply said to us, you've got to keep going forever, if need be, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, keep going until we've got all this through.
Looking back, I'm really baffled and rather ashamed by the fact that I, along with Bill Cash and a number of other of the usual suspects, as it were, voted for it. And I'm not sure that I gave the Single European Act the close attention that I should have done. I felt that if Mrs. Thatcher, with her well-known nationalistic views, was happy with the Single European Act, that I ought to be able to go along with it.
I can well remember going through that night and on to Friday morning and having rather pathetic Conservative colleagues coming along saying, now look, Teddy, you've made your point, but look, we've got this terribly important coffee morning we've got to go to. We've been up all night, we're desperately said, well, you've made your point, haven't you? And we were passing through one of the most complex, serious treaties with Europe which Britain has ever engaged in. 10
years on, the official story has changed. The deal was okay on paper, It was the treacherous Europeans who undermined it.
Some of the declarations in the margins of the Single European Act, solemnly entered into by heads of government in Europe, on which anyone could feel entitled to rely, have not subsequently been honoured. People have tried to get round them, the Commission in particular, by using other articles of the treaty when they were clearly not intended to be used, articles of the treaty which require only majority voting instead of unanimity. On that, frankly, we were diddled, and that's bad.
But was it the Europeans who were to blame, or someone else?
The amount of cheating has really been, of that kind has been very, very small. It should have been clear at the time that given the substantial change made in the Single European Act, the enlargement of majority voting, it was going to be like that. So I think there is not really a great scope for surprise. I think that signing that act, she should have known what she'd done. It was a very big step.
Mrs. Thatcher's supporters now say she was misled by the Foreign Office.
I feel so passionately, and Mrs. Thatcher's recent statements have shown it. She was definitely conned over the Single European Act.
I mean, this seems to me an amazing thing for them to say, because first of all, it's rather rude about heroin, and secondly, I mean, it wasn't life wasn't like that. I mean, one always had to explain every line to her.
She now claims she didn't understand exactly what was happening. She knows perfectly well this woman is totally in control of every facet of policy. She knew that this was a big expansion of majority voting.
Mrs. Thatcher was, in many ways, the sort of the Trojan horse. The British veto position, which had been held on to as vigorously as possible, was now substantially abandoned by the one British Prime Minister who took, generally speaking, the most resolutely critical line against the European community. It is a paradox.
And so, during 5 nights in the House of Commons, Britain gave up more power to Brussels than it had done during all the long debates of the 1970s. And irony of ironies, who was the person who sacrificed sovereignty in this way, whose place in history would be not just as a battler on the budget, but as someone who had laid the foundation for a potential European superstate? Margaret Thatcher.
It is etched on my heart. I trusted them. I believed in them. I believed this was good faith between nations cooperating together. So we got our fingers burned. Once you've got your fingers burned, you don't go and burn them again.